Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we are going to be diving into the world of export documentation in shipping.
Okay.
Super important topic, as you know. And we're using this awesome book called Scenario-Based Manual for Export Documentation in Shipping by Alborz Payvandi to guide us through this. And this manual is really neat because it uses real-world scenarios and examples.
Yeah.
So really practical stuff, which is what we love. So to help us make sense of all this, we have an expert here.
Hello. Happy to be here.
So jumping right into it, this manual highlights like 10 reasons why documentation is so important in shipping. What do you think are like the top 3 that someone who's like just starting out in this field should really, really pay attention to?
Well, I think, all 10 are important, but I would say if you're just starting out, you have to, really understand the legal side of it.
Okay.
Compliance is a big deal.
Yeah, for sure.
And then, operational efficiency, I think, is something that a lot of people overlook. And that can really trip you up if you don't have a good handle on your documentation.
Right.
And then building trust with your customers.
Oh, yeah.
That's huge because, if you're not reliable, then they're not going to want to work with you.
Makes total sense. It's almost like good documentation is kind of like a foundation for a lot of these other things.
Absolutely.
Like if you don't have that foundation, you can't build the rest.
Exactly.
Okay, so this manual kind of sets the scene with like a day in the life of an export documentation executive. Her name's Jasmine.
Oh, yeah.
And she seems to have a pretty crazy day. What are some of the things that like someone like Jasmine has to deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Well, she's got to juggle all these different shipment requests from different clients.
Mm-hmm.
And each one is going to have its own unique set of requirements and deadlines.
Mm-hmm.
She's also got to be really careful about verifying all the customs details.
Right.
Make sure all of her paperwork is in order. Because, one little mistake there can cause huge delay.
Oh, for sure.
And then, she's got to be in constant communication with all these different parties involved, like overseas partners, shipping lines, customs officials.
Right.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It sounds very intense.
It is.
Okay, so let's zoom in on like one specific part of this.
Okay.
When we talk about exporting a container, what are the steps involved? Like, how does that actually work?
Well, it all starts with the shipper.
Okay.
They request an empty container and specify the port of loading and the destination port.
Okay.
And then the sales team gets involved to confirm things like costs, container availability, make sure there's space on the ship.
Right.
And then once everything's sort of agreed upon, then the shipper submits a formal shipping order.
Gotcha. So the shipping order is kind of where things really kick off.
Yeah.
And the manual spends a lot of time talking about this document. Why is it so important?
Well, think of it as the roadmap for the shipment. It has all the key information like the customer's details, the ports of loading and destination, description of the goods, who to notify when it arrives at the destination, any special instructions.
So it's like kind of telling everyone what to do?
Exactly. It's like the instruction manual for the whole process.
Okay.
And it has to be super accurate because any mistakes can lead to delays and confusion, and nobody wants that.
Right. And the manual also talks about how it's not just enough to like fill out the shipping order correctly, but you also have to get it confirmed by the shipper. Why is that step so important?
Well, it's all about accountability.
Well, okay.
When the shipper confirms the order, it means they're taking responsibility for the accuracy of the information.
Gotcha.
So if there are any problems down the line, you know who to go back to.
Okay, so that makes sense. It's like a checks and balances system.
Exactly.
Okay. And then I know the manual gives some examples of like what can go wrong when shipping orders are incomplete.
Oh, yeah.
Can you walk us through one of those?
Sure. Let's say a shipping order is missing some crucial details about hazardous materials. Yeah. Like the IMTHO classification codes.
Okay.
Those codes are like a universal language for identifying dangerous goods.
Gotcha.
So if those codes are missing, it's a big problem.
Yeah.
The shipping line won't know what they're dealing with. The port authorities won't know what to expect. Mm-hmm. It creates a real safety hazard.
So that's a situation where like a seemingly small detail can have a huge impact.
Exactly. And that's why attention to detail is so crucial in this line of work.
Okay, so we've talked about the shipping order. What else do we need to know? Is there anything else that's like super important?
Well, there's this concept of free time in shipping.
Free time. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that?
So basically, it's like a grace period that shippers get to pick up an empty container and return a full one without incurring any extra charges.
Oh, so it's like a buffer.
Exactly. It gives them some flexibility in their logistics.
Okay, so there's like a separate free time for picking up the empty container and then another free time for returning the full one.
That's right. And the exact time frames can vary depending on the shipping line and the location.
Okay, so what happens if a shipper goes over that free time? Like, what are the consequences?
Well, that's when demurrage charges come into play.
Demurrage.
It's basically a penalty for exceeding the free time.
Okay.
And those fees can add up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I bet. So time is really money in this business.
It really is.
Okay, so the manual emphasizes that customer service reps need to be able to explain this whole free time and demurrage thing really clearly to shippers.
Yeah.
What are some tips for doing that effectively?
Well, I think the key is to keep it simple. Avoid using too much technical jargon.
Okay.
Explain it in a way that anyone can understand.
Right.
And be prepared to answer questions.
Mm-hmm.
Shippers are going to have a lot of questions about this.
Yeah.
And, be proactive. Don't wait for them to call you with a problem. Reach out to them in advance. Let them know how much free time they have, how to avoid demurrage charges.
So it's all about communication and transparency.
Exactly.
Okay, this has been awesome. We've talked about why documentation is so important, the steps involved in exporting a container, and even this whole concept of free time and demurrage charges.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's fascinating stuff.
It is.
And we're just getting started.
Yeah.
All right. Welcome back to our deep dive into export documentation. Now we're going to get a little more practical.
Yeah.
What are some big red flags or common mistakes that people new to this whole world should be watching out for?
Well, one of the most common mistakes I see is people not double checking the information on the shipping order against other key documents.
Okay.
Like the commercial invoice and the packing list.
Gotcha.
Everything has to match up perfectly.
Right.
Because if there's even a small discrepancy, it can cause big problems down the line.
Right, like a domino effect.
Exactly. And another thing to remember is that every country has its own unique set of rules and regulations when it comes to imports.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So you got to do your research,
Yeah. Yeah.
Make sure you're complying with all the specific requirements for the destination country.
Right, because otherwise you're going to run into problems.
Oh, yeah. Your shipment could get held up at customs or even rejected altogether.
Wow. Yeah, that would be a nightmare.
It would. And that's why it's so important to stay organized and keep meticulous records.
Okay, so organization is key. We've talked about accuracy, attention to detail, but what about communication? How important is that in this whole process?
Communication is crucial.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not just about being clear and concise, but it's also about being proactive.
Proactive. Okay.
Like anticipating potential problems before they arise.
Yeah.
Keeping everyone informed.
Right.
And responding to inquiries quickly and efficiently.
Okay, so it's not just about sending emails back and forth. It's about actually thinking ahead and making sure everyone's on the same page.
That's exactly right. And I think it's also important to build strong relationships with the people you're working with.
Okay.
The shipping lines, the customs brokers, the freight forwarders.
Right.
Because when you have those relationships in place, it makes everything run a lot smoother.
Makes sense. So it's not just about the paperwork, it's about the people too.
Absolutely. It's a people business.
Okay, so I know the manual talks about certain reports that need to be generated at various stages.
Uh-huh.
Can you give us an example of one report and why it's so important?
Sure. Let's take the arrival notice.
Okay.
This report is sent directly to the consignee, the person who's receiving the goods.
Gotcha.
And it lets them know that their cargo has arrived and gives them instructions on how to pick it up.
Okay.
It helps to prevent any unnecessary delays or storage costs.
Okay, so it's basically just keeping everyone informed.
That's right. And it's important to get the timing right, too.
Yeah.
Because if you send the arrival notice too early, the consignee might not be ready to receive the goods, right? And if you send it too late, they might incur storage charges.
So it's got to be the Goldilocks zone.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of customer satisfaction, the manual also highlights some common mistakes that customer service reps should avoid.
Oh, yeah.
What are some of the big ones that you've seen?
Well, one of the most common ones is providing incorrect or incomplete information to customers.
Okay.
It might seem like a small thing, but it can really damage your credibility and lead to a lot of frustration.
Yeah.
So it's really important to double check everything before you communicate with the customer.
Right.
Make sure you have all the facts straight.
Yeah.
Another mistake is failing to follow up with customers in a timely manner.
Okay.
in this business time is of the essence,
Right.
Customers want to know what's happening with their shipments, and they expect quick responses to their inquiries.
So don't leave them hanging.
Exactly.
Okay, I've got another one for you. The manual mentions specific situations where the export department shouldn't issue the bill of lading to the shipper. Why would they do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes it's necessary to hold on to the bill of lading until certain conditions are met.
Okay.
Like if there are discrepancies in the cargo description,
Okay.
or if payment hasn't been received in full.
Gotcha.
It's kind of like a safeguard,
Right.
It protects both the shipping line and the shipper from potential problems down the road.
So it's like a checks and balances thing.
Exactly.
Okay, this has been super helpful. We've learned about common mistakes, important reports, and even the bill of lading.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep in mind.
It is, but it's all part of the fascinating world of export documentation.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to our final deep dive into this world of export documentation. I feel like we've covered so much already.
Yeah.
Like from the documents themselves to communication to customer service. Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think a good way to wrap things up is to talk about some real world scenarios.
Okay, yeah.
The kind of challenges that really test your knowledge and your problem solving skills.
Yeah, for sure. And the manual does a great job of presenting these scenarios. So
Yep.
Let's dive into one. Let's say you're a customer service rep and a customer calls in super frustrated about a demurrage charge. They're insisting they return the container on time, but the records show otherwise. What do you even do?
Okay, so this is a classic scenario, and it happens more often than you think.
Okay.
And it really highlights the importance of clear communication, empathy, and documentation.
Okay.
So the first thing you do is you explain the demurrage policy to the customer in a calm and clear way. Make sure to reference the specific dates and times involved.
Okay.
But it's not enough to just tell them, you have to show them the proof.
Okay. So back it up.
Exactly. You got to provide documentation.
Yeah.
Like date logs, timestamps.
Yeah.
Anything that supports your side of the story.
So basically you're saying transparency is key.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Transparency builds trust, even in difficult conversations like this.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you also need to listen to the customer.
Yeah.
Really try to understand their perspective.
Right.
Even if they're wrong.
Yeah.
Empathy goes a long way in these situations.
Okay. So it's like a balance.
It is a delicate balance.
Between sticking to the facts and also acknowledging their feelings.
Exactly. And even if the customer is still adamant that they're not at fault, you got to stay professional.
Right.
Offer to investigate further, maybe review any additional evidence they might have.
Yeah.
And if all else fails, escalate the issue to a supervisor.
So basically you're saying it's all about finding a solution that works for both sides.
That's right. It's not about winning or losing. It's about being fair and reasonable.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've learned a ton about documentation, and I think it's safe to say that it's way more than just paperwork.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's this intricate system with so many moving parts.
And it all has to work together seamlessly.
Exactly.
If one piece is out of place, the whole thing can fall apart.
Right, and it's not just about following the rules, it's about understanding the why behind them.
Exactly.
And being able to apply that knowledge in real-world situations.
Like those tricky customer service calls.
Yep.
That's where the real learning happens.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. What other factors besides the documentation itself can affect how effective and efficient these processes are?
That's a great question. I would say things like technology.
Okay.
The tools and systems you use can make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
Communication is key, as we've discussed.
Right.
So having the right communication channels in place is crucial.
Sure.
And then training, making sure your staff is properly trained on all aspects of export documentation.
Makes sense.
And finally, I would say company culture.
Company culture. Okay, how does that play into it?
Well, if you have a culture that values accuracy, attention to detail, and customer service,
Yeah.
then your export documentation processes are going to run a lot smoother.
So it's not just about individual effort, it's about the whole organization working together.
Exactly. It's a team effort.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive informative and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Yeah.
Export documentation might not be the most glamorous topic.
It's not always the most exciting.
But it's a vital part of global trade.
It really is.
And it can be a really rewarding career.
Absolutely.
So if you're looking for a challenge that involves problem solving, attention to detail, and making a real impact on the world,
This might be the field for you.
Thanks again for joining us, and until next time, happy shipping.